My name is Brody Fisher. I am not at all a member of the Katzworth generation, although I was a member of the Coatsworth generation that followed. And in fact had the great misfortune of applying to graduate school in precisely the year that John was leaving Chicago. And so it's rather poignant actually to look around this room, because I met many of you when I came for a visit at University of Chicago. And I remember thinking what an incredibly dynamic program it was, and how many people there were, and what the conversations were like, and being so enthusiastic, and also thinking that it was the end of a time. And so as I look around here, I almost feel like I know many of you well, because I've used so many of your books, and most of your work has been so important in my formation, even as a Brazilianist. And sadly, the only Brazilianist who is going to be here is not. But it's really been, your generation, I think, has shaped the field and shaped our thinking in ways that very few others have. And so it's really an honor to be here. And I'd like to introduce briefly our speakers. I'm going to do all the introductions first, and then I will be strict about enforcing time limits, as I've been told to do. Our first speaker is going to be Cristóbal Aljovín de Lozada. He had his PhD from University of Chicago in 1996 and is now a professor at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Peru. And he has written a remarkable number of edited books, as well as 2 single-authored books about politics and constitutionalism in Peru. Many of you probably know him much better than I do, and so I'll leave it at that for now. But like everyone here, he's really someone who is cited and talked about extensively. Laura Gotkowitz had her PhD from 1998. She is currently an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, and has also taught at Iowa and Swarthmore and Harvard. Her book, A Revolution for Our Rights, Indigenous Struggles for Land and Justice in Bolivia, rightly was the winner of the AHA FAG Prize for 2008. Her work on race and revolution and now political violence is followed fairly avidly, I would say, by lots of people in the field. And it's really wonderful to hear about this new project today. Peter Gardino is, I think, on this panel, perhaps the person who first graduated, 1992. Is that correct? Or perhaps you were a little bit before.
You win.
And looking at
16 at the time.
And looking at Peter's CV is enough to humble even the proudest person. The list of publications and books and talks given, and the variety of service that he manages to give to the profession, on top of being a wonderful scholar and chair of his department for his sins in the last several years, is really remarkable. And his work has really shaped discussions about popular liberalism, especially in 19th century Mexico. I think all of us have engaged with it at one time or another. And finally, Richard Warren, whose PhD is from 1994, if I'm correct, has written on subjects that are very dear to my heart. His book, Vagrants and Citizens, Politics and the Masses in Mexico City from Colony to Republic, was a prize-winning volume on those themes that was published in 2001. And he now teaches at the history department at St. Joseph's University, and is someone that any urban historian pays attention to. And it's just really a pleasure to meet you and to have you on this panel. Thank you.
Bueno,
Go ahead, Mr. White.
me permitiré hablar en español, espero que todos entiendan. Segundo, Eric me ha dicho que tengo que hablar en voz alta, tipo líder, sindical leader. Trataré, si no, por favor levánteme. Antes de empezar mi tema, quiero ser un poco sentimental y añadir algunos puntos sobre mi vinculación con el profesor Coatsworth y el profesor Katz. Para mí, los mayores aportes de ambos en mi formación fueron la agudeza de sus preguntas, la generosidad de tiempo. Me acuerdo que iba a Harvard a visitar al profesor Coatsworth y leía y abría un hueco y discutíamos. Y sobre todo recuerdo mucho esa obsesión por la historia comparativa, ¿no? Siempre me comparaban, casi siempre me jalaba para comparar Perú y México. La conclusión de mi libro, de mi primer libro, hay muchísima comparación entre Perú y México desde la época prehispánica hasta el 19. Y recuerdo, y aquí sí hay un poco de demasiado sentimiento, me acuerdo del profesor Katz en Cusco con Yana taking photos all the time, y recuerdo que Katz no paraba de preguntarme, me preguntaba y me preguntaba, ¿qué piensas de esto? ¿Qué piensas de esto? ¿Qué piensas de esto? ¿Qué piensas de esto? Sometimes I like him, because I didn't know the answer, pero bueno, tenía que, de algún modo yo era su estudiante y tenía que mostrarle que había leído esos libros. Espero que nunca me hizo trampa. Y recuerdo haber caminado por la ciudad de Cusco y él de lo más emocionado. Bueno, tengo que confesar un secreto de Katz, es que él nunca había estado en el Perú y había escrito unos libros clásicos de la historia del Perú, que era la comparación entre el imperio incaico y el imperio azteca. Entonces él estaba fascinado, paseándose por el Cusco y haciéndome referencia de su libro y cuál era la diferencia entre el Cusco y la capital azteca. ¿No? Entonces hay una linda relación que tuve con ambos de una pasión por la historia y también por cuestiones contemporáneas. Recuerdo una vez con el profesor Coatsworth en Harvard que se sentó en la mesa, estábamos en el restaurante de la Universidad de Harvard, y me dijo, estoy muy confundido, no sé qué cosa está bien o mal, pero al menos sé que matar está mal, ¿no? Y en algún sentido lo que me estaba diciendo es que hay muchas zonas grises, pero hay momentos en los cuales uno puede discernir lo que está bien y lo que está mal, ¿no? O sea, siempre de algún modo ambos profesores me dieron no solamente conocimiento histórico, ser un gran intelectual, sino una moral, pensar lo que está bien y lo que está mal de modo muy sencillo, sin ninguna pompa, sin ningún libro teórico, y en verdad las agradezco muchísimo. Y quiero ahondar un poco más en la relación que tuve aquí en Chicago, en el workshop, en este intercambio de ideas. Me acuerdo que yo organicé el workshop durante un tiempo con Robin, con Débora, nos ayudamos, traíamos a la gente de antropología, invitamos gente y formamos una comunidad. Y aquí tengo que mencionar a Nils, ¿no? Que de algún modo era parte de Chicago Boys, de Good Chicago Boys, ¿no? Y quiero mencionar también muchísima generosidad. Chuck, me acuerdo, yo escogí tratar un tema en el cual cubríamos los mismos años y Chuck igualito me hablaba, me daba información, etc. No había ningún celo. Obviamente con Paul no lo conocía porque él se había ido, ya había terminado, pero de algún modo los tres que hicimos Perú hicimos Early Republican Times. Y puede ser una cosa complicada, porque si ustedes conocen el mundo académico, tocar temas similares es como uno, you want to kill the other. Y Chuck nunca me mató, y eso hay que reconocer, y fue muy generoso. Yeah, he's a killer. Yeah, don't worry. Do you know that always I believe in Nietzsche, and he said that the best student is the student who killed his professor, you know, that es el mayor homenaje al profesor, don't worry. But realmente fue muy emocionante estar aquí y verdaderamente aprendí más que cuestiones intelectuales y eso, y hice un juramento, no openly, but que yo siempre quise tratar a mis estudiantes en el Perú igual como me trataron en Chicago, ¿no? Y eso es para mí, creo que el mayor homenaje que le puedo rendir a Katz and Coatsworth. Okay, no more emotions. Go back to my point. Y parte del tema muestra también una generosidad de ambos, porque verdaderamente yo hice lo que quise hacer en esta universidad. Hasta recuerdo haber llevado un curso sobre la Biblia, ¿no? Algo bastante lejano a los estudios latinoamericanos. Coatsworth no estaba, pero me acuerdo haber llevado sobre el Torah. Yo lo que quiero presentar hoy día es una parte de un plan muy ambicioso que tengo, que es, yo he estado en un grupo de investigación de Iberconceptos, que es estudiar los conceptos claves de la política latinoamericana, donde ha habido brasileños también, y han reunido como 120 historiadores iberoamericanos de España, Portugal, México, Centroamérica, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Colombia. Y la idea era estudiar conceptos claves de la política moderna. Y este proyecto se llama Iberconceptos. Hemos publicado un diccionario y vamos a publicar un segundo. Y lo que yo aspiro a hacer en un futuro es, leyendo estos dos diccionarios, tratar de explicar de algún modo, no sé si el imaginario iberoamericano, pero en términos de ensayo o solamente de los Andes. Todo depende cuánta energía tengo. Recuerdo que cuando hice mi tesis había pensado llegar hasta 1870 y hasta 1845. ¿Ya? Eso creo que a todo el mundo le pasa. Entonces, es un tema sobre... el diccionario, digamos, trabaja qué cosa significa, cómo la gente pensaba federalismo, qué pensaban de república, qué pensaba sobre ciudadanía, pero pensando que los conceptos políticos son polisemánticos, que eso es bien importante en términos teóricos, porque te muestra la flexibilidad en la cual tanto un dictador como un demócrata pueden utilizar la palabra democracia, digamos, ¿no? Y el proyecto, en verdad, trata desde fines del siglo XIX, desde fines del XVIII hasta el XIX, pero en verdad es para tratar la política del XIX. Tiene una serie de problemas el estudio de los conceptos políticos. Uno de ellos es que son conceptos en español, ¿no? Los que saben los Andes, esa es donde la mayoría de gente hablaba quechua y aymara, ¿no? También quienes piensan a través de este imaginario político es un mundo más ligado a las ciudades, al ejército, a los pueblos, más que al mundo de las haciendas. Digamos, lo que quiero es limitar un poco de dónde viene este imaginario político y parte también de la premisa de que en 1808, con la crisis de la corona española, hay una resemantización de los términos políticos, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, nosotros no trabajamos vasallo, que sería un término muy importante para el XVIII y no es importante para el siglo XIX. Y también el proyecto, por lo menos si uno lo ve desde América Latina, algo que es importante es comprender que el mundo ideológico, político, decimonónico es un mundo republicano y es un mundo diferente al europeo por una sencilla razón. En Europa había una suerte de guerra fría, una guerra ideológica entre la gente que defendía la monarquía y la gente que defendía el republicanismo. Nosotros, de algún modo, no. A tal punto en el cual los mismos caudillos, y eso imagino que Peter lo tratará también, utilizaban un lenguaje republicano, pero a su modo, digamos. Yo quisiera, porque yo he trabajado 3 ideas que creo que son centrales en ese diccionario. Uno es la idea de la unidad en la política, otro es la idea de la virtud en la política y otro es la idea de la igualdad en la política. Solamente quiero hablar sobre la idea de la unidad para de algún modo hacer algo coherente hoy día, ¿no? ¿A qué me refiero? ¿Cómo se imaginaba la política en el XIX? ¿No? Hay en la política democrática siempre hay una relación paradójica en pensar en términos de unidad o en términos de pluralidad de la política. En pensar en algo muy sencillo, gobierno y oposición, ¿no? O el gobierno se siente representando toda la nación o sienten que la nación puede ser algo fragmentado y que la política puede representar intereses, ¿no? Es algo fundamental porque es cómo se imagina la política en el siglo XIX. Es una de las razones por las cuales el nacimiento de partidos políticos o clubes políticos tarda tanto. Y esto, estoy hablando del Perú, pero obviamente esto es una historia transnacional. Estas es un imaginario compartido con sus variables en diferentes países. Y idea de unidad en la política, digamos que la política tiene que formar una unidad y no puede representar intereses, tiene diferentes orígenes y diferentes fuerzas. Oh my goodness. I just start. Yeah. Oh. Look, I'm short. Huh? I'm a Chicago boy. I write very. Okay. Bueno, tiene una base de que la política, por ejemplo, en la época colonial, es esa idea holística de la política, digamos, en el cual todo el mundo forma una unidad alrededor del rey, no una unidad patriarcal, digamos, donde no es una política diseminada en individuos, o también uno lo puede ver en la voluntad general de Rousseau. Entonces, por varios lados hay este problema de la pluralidad y la unidad. Lo que domina la política del siglo, de la primera mitad del siglo XIX, es una concepción unitaria de la política, en la cual la oposición de algún modo son antipatriotas. Y entonces se junta un lenguaje de ser patriotas y representar la nación, en contra de... y los que no están en ese grupo deben estar excluidos. Es una concepción bastante autoritaria de la concepción de la política y muy pensada por los discursos de los caudillos, así como los discursos de civiles. Dicha concepción de la política obviamente se enfrenta con dos realidades muy duras. Una es que la sociedad está compuesta por intereses y segundo, que el sistema parlamentario termina generando partidos políticos, ¿no? Y entonces, lo que vamos viendo en el siglo XIX, sobre todo en la segunda mitad del siglo XIX, y todo depende de las fechas, va variando de país en país, es que comienza a haber una noción de que el mundo asociativo es algo positivo, el mundo de los partidos políticos es algo positivo. Quiero recordar, I have 3 minutes, quiero recordar que en el mundo europeo los grandes teóricos de la política consideraban que los partidos políticos eran una aberración, ¿no? Y que recién a fines del XIX comienza a haber esa idea a favor de los partidos políticos. Y entonces comienzan a surgir partidos políticos, y esos partidos políticos en el Perú implica un líder, significa agenda política, esta idea, pero no es una concepción totalmente pluralista de la política, porque hay una noción de que a partir de que ganan en las elecciones, debería fusionarse los partidos. Entonces, por lo menos en el periodo que yo estudio, todavía no hay una concepción de la política en términos pluralistas, ¿no? Aquí quiero acabar porque... ¿Tengo 3 minutos? Oh my goodness, ya. Entonces, ¿qué cosa es importante de lo que estoy diciendo? Es cómo se va transformando el vocabulario político, de la lucha política, y cómo se concibe la política en el Perú, y eso también es en el resto de América Latina, porque he leído miles de páginas de otros países que me mandaban, una concepción en la cual siempre está unido esta idea de unidad en la política y pluralidad en la política. Hasta el día de hoy, si uno ve, por ejemplo, el discurso de Fujimori, que era la antipolítica, en verdad es un discurso a favor de la unidad en la política, ¿no? En el cual los grupos que están fuera de su grupo son grupos en el cual están en contra de la nación. Entonces, lo que estudio aquí es parte del discurso republicano de inicios del siglo XIX, que continúa durante todo el siglo XX y cómo se va transformando. Y en el caso de la unidad y la pluralidad, por ejemplo, hay dos conceptos claves que nos pueden ayudar mucho a comprender eso. Uno es partido político y facción, ¿no? Cuando partido es una cosa y facción es otra cosa, ¿no? Porque al inicio partido y facción se confunden, y el otro es el término de patriota, ¿no? En términos de el patriota como representante de la nación. Bueno, aquí, don't worry, I finish. No, thank you very much.
Un minuto te queda.
No, I adore Claudia. A Laura le regalo mi minuto.
Muchas gracias, muy generosa.
Yeah.
And I hope that I will not make Laura as nervous when I show her.
I'm prepared for it now, I've seen it. Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking Chuck and Emilio and everyone in this room. It is so nice to be here. Thank you all. And what I want to do in my paper is to use insights from the Katzworth School of Comparative and International Approaches to Latin American History to think about an aspect of my current research in progress on the thousands of European exiles who took refuge in Bolivia in the 1930s and 1940s. Bolivia is almost never associated with immigration. Its World War II era story, and I'll get to the story in a minute, makes sense, I think, only when viewed in a comparative and pan-Latin American framework. My talk has a Katzworth organization. Part 1 is the client, the colossi, and the secret war in Bolivia. Part 2 is lives and time, and part 3 is comparative. So before I get to that, I want to just give a little bit of introduction. I was very, very lucky to have had the chance to discuss this research a couple of times with Friedrich. And as you can imagine, he was an extraordinary source of wisdom and advice. He recommended OSS records, Freedom of Information Act requests, German sources, Alemania Libre. And as on any occasion you might speak with him, he also had a story. Once he told me a couple of jokes that Austrian exiles gathered in Vienna after the end of the war shared with each other. And unfortunately, I just don't remember the details. But they were about how lucky you were if you made it to Mexico or Argentina instead of Bolivia, where life was so tough. One of the jokes ended with someone miraculously scrambling over the Bolivian border into northern Argentina. I wish I could remember the whole story, but beyond the content, there's a lot to be gleaned from the telling. And you can imagine how artful was the telling by Friedrich Katz. In a most general sense, the telling of the jokes points to the politics of exile, by which I mean several things. First, there's the unequal status of potential sites of refuge. Second, there's the ironic humor that accompanies the serendipitous encounters and tragic realities of survival. Third, the jokes point not to one, but to many exile communities, stretching across Latin America and creating a vast diaspora of connected and disconnected lives. Fourth, the jokes might inspire us to think about the trans-border qualities of rescue to people in multiple locations whose actions saved lives, not only because they followed the spirit rather than the letter of the law, but also because their motivations were not tied to a particular state. And finally, and I'm not going to be able to get to this in my talk, but I think it's worth mentioning, there is the politics of return, of communities divided, reconstituted, and irrevocably transformed by exile in Latin America. So the question is, where does Bolivia fit in this larger Latin American and trans-Latin American story? Between mid-1938 and the beginning of 1940, when borders were closing around the world, as many as 10,000 Europeans fleeing the Nazis came to Bolivia. And it was quite likely more, maybe as many as 15,000. Some people say even more than that. There will be numbers and charts in this book, though I cannot promise regression analysis. Most of these refugees were Jewish. The per capita number of Jewish refugees who went to Bolivia at this time was greater than that taken in by any other country in the Americas. So many that the train to La Paz from the port in Arica, Chile, was known as the Jewish Express. The great wave of migration commenced around June 1938 when Bolivia announced that its doors were open to all healthy people who wanted to work its lands. It lasted until about the end of 1939 when the Minister of Foreign Affairs and others were charged in a corruption case known as the Visa Affair. They were accused of violating Bolivian immigration policy, depriving the national treasury of revenue. Financial guarantees that were presumably required of immigrants had been waived, and they were also accused of benefiting from the sale of passports and visas. The few existing works on this topic generally present the Bolivian story as unique, as something that no other Latin American country was willing to do on the eve of the war. I want to try and refine that impression by thinking in a Katzworthian comparative and pan-Latin American frame. So the first part of the paper is the client, the colossi, and the secret war. If any South American country fits John's definition of the client state, that country is Bolivia. Not anymore, of course, but in the 1940s, in many respects, yes. But at the same time, there was also concern that Bolivia was on the verge of becoming a client state of Nazi Germany. People linked, for example, to the Pan-American Union in Washington held meetings about the Bolivia problem, by which they meant the Nazi threat in Bolivia. In an essay on German imperialism in Latin America, first published in 1966, Friedrich makes extensive use of German sources to illuminate the role of Nazi Germany in the secret wars of the early 1940s. He devotes significant attention to something known as the Belmonte Letter, which divulged a plot by the German embassy and Bolivian nationalists to overthrow the Bolivian government in 1941. His essay betrays a certain passion for unraveling the plot. After all, he was a great fan of spy novels. And I once had the wonderful opportunity of a little tour of his library in his home when they still lived in Hyde Park. And he showed me the Mexico books and the Latin America books. And then he got to a little shelf that was right next to a very comfortable looking couch, and he said, and these are my most important books, and they were very inexpensive spy novels. So he argues that there was a genuine basis to this conspiracy and to other conspiracies, but he concludes that Nazi propaganda had more influence in Bolivia than anywhere else in Latin America. He concludes two things. First of all, that Nazi propaganda mattered more than conspiracies. So the conspiracies, I mean, a lot of people discount them, but he thinks that there was some genuine basis to them, and especially to this one in Bolivia. But in the end, he concludes that Nazi propaganda mattered a lot more than the conspiracies. And he also concludes that Nazi propaganda had more influence in Bolivia than anywhere else in Latin America. So what that means is that within South America, Bolivia was rather unusual. It was the country that most conformed to US dictates and at the same time showed especially strong Nazi influence. In discussing German policy in Latin America and in analyzing US-Latin American relations, both Katz and Coatsworth pay close attention to non-state actors. In Latin America in the 1940s, this includes Germans and German speakers who were pro and anti-Nazi, local citizens and governments that supported or opposed Nazism, anti-Nazi representatives of US-based aid organizations, and political and Jewish exiles. So there's a wide range of actors. Some of the European exiles in Bolivia intervened in local anti-Nazi politics. For example, a group of them was calling for the expulsion of the German ambassador around this plot. But the exiles were also connected to global anti-fascism via pan-Latin American networks. These actors and the networks were crucial to the unfolding rescue effort in Bolivia. Using them as a point of departure, I want to turn to the lives and the time that shaped Bolivia's role in the refugee crisis. And I'm obviously taking inspiration from Katz's method in his book on Pancho Villa, but I also want to note that he wrote a number of short biographical and autobiographical or semi-autobiographical pieces. Many of these touch on Nazism, anti-Nazism, and exile in Latin America, a topic that ran parallel to his interests in the Mexican Revolution. I say lives instead of life because it is not possible to identify one individual in Bolivia who played the outstanding role, as is possible, for example, in the case of Mexico, where the rescue of European refugees can be summed up in one name, and that is Gilberto Bosques. Bolivia's contribution was the product of a vast network that stretched from La Paz to small towns on the Argentine border, to Buenos Aires, Paris, Marseille, Hamburg, Vienna, Warsaw, and Prague. It's hard to say exactly who did what because much of the activity was covered up. The time was the eve of World War II, but it may make more sense to call it the time of anti-fascism. So, the lives. I want to just say a little bit about 4 individuals who shaped migration from Europe to Bolivia in 1938 and 1939. One key figure is Mauricio Hochschild, a German Jewish tin mining magnate with interests in Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. Hochschild appealed to U.S. officials and organizations to support Jewish migration to Bolivia via rural colonization schemes in underpopulated parts of the country. He helped finance the migration of German and Austrian Jews, but came to oppose the migration of Polish Jews. Hochschild was at the center of a great struggle in Bolivia between German Jews promoting a legal and systematic migration and Eastern European Jews calling for immigration at all costs and in any manner. The effects of this divide had long-lasting legacies, but divisions also emerged among Eastern Europeans. It would be too much to recount right now, but the point I want to make is that the unfolding experience of refugees in Bolivia shaped the politics of rescue and vice versa. The second key figure is Eduardo Díaz de Medina, Bolivia's Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1938 and 1939. At the 1938 Pan American Conference in Lima, he sponsored a proposal calling on the United States and all the American nations to open their borders to immigration and to counter reactionary racism. The speech came after Bolivia had already opened its borders. Díaz de Medina considered it the humane thing to do. Like Hochschild, he also believed that migration would contribute to Bolivian progress, but not only in the countryside. His open immigration policy relied on consular agents in European cities, especially Paris, as well as on a group, and this is really interesting, as a group of foreigners who returned to Europe in 1938 and 1939 to facilitate other people's migration. They were known as special immigration agents. They actually had special Bolivian documentation designating them as such. Apparently, they gave or sold visas or passports to people who never visited a consular office. Díaz de Medina resigned in May 1939, not only because of the accusations about the visas, but also because he objected to Bolivia's recognition of Franco and because he was not consulted concerning Bolivian agreements with Germany. If we compare Hochschild and Díaz de Medina, we can see 2 distinct visions that bridge key concepts of the time: population, anti-fascism, and race. The third key figure I want to mention is Gustavo Koslich, one of the ministry's special agents, so one of the people who had this special documentation. What about Cristobal's minute? That's included? Koslich was a Polish Jew who emigrated to Buenos Aires in the 1910s and 1920s, and acquired Bolivian nationality in 1938. It is not known yet if he actually went to Bolivia, but he had Bolivian citizenship. He returned to Europe during the same year and facilitated the migration of perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, of people, probably using collective visas signed in blank by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Koslich was a co-defendant in absentia in the corruption case that I mentioned. According to the final report on this trial, he and another special agent established clandestine immigration offices on the streets of Paris and communicated directly with the ministry in La Paz via cable. Koslich was arrested and tortured by the Nazis in France in 1943. He died in France in 1972. A fourth crucial actor were the political and Jewish refugees gathering in La Paz, because while this was happening, all of these people were going there and were creating communities, and they were creating organizations and institutions and publications of all kinds. There's a wonderful Spanish-Yiddish bilingual journal that was published. One such person was Paul Bender, a German Jewish communist who fled Germany via Czechoslovakia in 1937. With special documents with social democrats in Bolivia, Bender created a German anti-Nazi organization that gave assistance to Europeans who were not receiving aid from the Jewish organization. I suspect it was the one run by Hochschild, but I'm not sure yet. After the pogroms of November 1938, Kristallnacht, Bender and other immigrants redoubled their efforts to bring more Europeans to Bolivia, including 40 of Bender's own relatives whom he successfully brought to Bolivia. In his efforts to support the global anti-fascist struggle, Bender helped connect the German anti-fascist movement in Bolivia with its counterpart in Mexico, Alemania Libre, with which Friedrich's father was affiliated. Keeping in mind this broad spectrum of actors and the complexities of individual lives, and I have only just scratched the surface, I want to end by returning to the great value of a Katzworthian comparative and international perspective. If we focus exclusively on nation states, almost everywhere in Latin America we would see increasingly restrictive immigration policies in 1938 and 1939. Even in Bolivia, where immigration officials favored openness, the law contained significant restrictions. To give a few examples, in Mexico, immigration laws were highly restrictive, and the numbers of Jews admitted officially in this period, this short window, was very small. But thanks to Gilberto Bosques, thousands of political and Jewish refugees from many European countries accompanied the 20 to 25,000 Spanish Republicans who were granted asylum and Mexican citizenship between 1939 and 1942. In Brazil and Argentina, immigration laws were highly restrictive in 1938 and 1939. Yet even in those years, thousands of European Jews crossed Brazilian and Argentinian borders via illegalities of various kinds. Not nearly as many as arrived in Bolivia on the eve of war, but large numbers. Many, in fact, first went to Bolivia but soon crossed to Argentina over its loosely patrolled northern border, as the jokes Katz told suggest. And I actually suspect that a very significant proportion of those who wound up in Argentina or Chile first went to Bolivia with Bolivian documents. Illegalities, bribes, sales on the side certainly played a role in Bolivia, but the overarching framework was distinct. In Bolivia, the crucial variable was a transnational network of state and non-state actors that put Europeans with Bolivian papers on the ground in Europe and Argentina. These roving agents dispensed so many visas and passports that they continued to be used even after the Bolivian government began to crack down. As John writes in The Clients and the Colossus, and as he said often in his classes, and I remember many times and many forms, actions speak louder than words. Fortunately, Bolivia had some of each. After the war, a Jewish man wrote to the Bolivian president from the US zone in Germany. He asked to immigrate to Bolivia since Bolivia was well known in Europe for its most human effort to give hospitality to the homeless, and because Bolivia showed such initiative concerning one of the most acute problems of mankind. That reputation was a legacy of actions carried out both before and after Díaz de Medina submitted his anti-racist proposal to the conference in Lima. It was a legacy of actions by a maze of people who were living a continental, hemispheric, and international time. If we put Bolivia's story of rescue in a Katzworthian framework that is both comparative and international, and we pay attention to individual and collective lives, I think we can see why Bolivia, like Mexico, at this catastrophic moment, also became a country of refuge.
Well, let me begin also by thanking everyone involved in organizing this. This has been a really profoundly emotional couple of days for me here, and I'm really enjoying myself a lot. So like most of you, I was very much influenced by Friedrich and John. In my case, what's kind of interesting is that influence tends to grow over time. I get further from graduate school, and somehow the influence grows. And I think in my case that can be kind of explained by the fact that I was a little dense, and now I'm beginning to understand some things I said 25 years ago. So it's taken me a while. I'm a slow learner. Okay. One thing people brought up here is how central comparison was to John and Friedrich. In the classroom, I remember some of the rather wonderful ones that Friedrich made in the classroom, in their writing, very explicitly in both cases. And what no one's quite mentioned is that this is a time when academia was actually kind of going in the other direction, in the sense of people were privileging more and more being specialists on extremely narrow topics. And they just wouldn't let us quite do that. Okay? Comparison was also central to the humiliation that John inflicted on me during my oral exams in the late 1980s. About 2/3 of the way through those grueling hours, I was feeling pretty good about myself. I hadn't yet been struck mute, and I just successfully navigated a series of questions from Ted Cook about the colonial US. Then John stepped up to the bat. No warming up for John. He went for the home run right away. He began by saying that my answers for Cook had collectively showed that many things people cherish about the American political system, such as political pluralism and religious tolerance, were not outcomes that any colonial actors consciously worked toward. They had instead evolved into being because no one trusted anyone else, and no one political or religious group in Anglo-America was able to impose its will on everyone else. John then gave an evil grin, and he asked me why political pluralism and religious tolerance had not evolved in colonial Latin America. This floored me. I spent hours brainstorming questions with fellow grad students, Chuck Walker, Rich Warren, Friedrich Schuler, all here, okay? And none of us had thought of a single question that was quite so bold, quite so broad, and yes, quite so comparative. And I totally flubbed it, okay? The only reason I walked out of that exam room knowing that I had passed was I knew that John was too nice to fail me. Thanks, John. This question really stuck to me, and it sort of stayed in the back of my mind for many years while I worked on things that were generally not explicitly comparative. And it was really only after I hit my 40s that I felt like I was sort of experienced enough to try to take this on. And what I've been doing in the last few years, actually more than a few years at this point, is I've been trying to write a social and cultural history of the 1846-48 war between the US and Mexico, mostly as a way of trying to compare the two countries at that moment. And so what I want to talk about today is sort of a little part of that. If it seems big, it's still just a little part of that. Soon after independence, both foreign and Latin American observers began to frame their analyses of Latin American politics around failure. And historians of the period have largely continued to do this. Whether Mexican or foreign, we tend to argue that in the early 19th century, Mexican politics were violent and unstable, and that formal politics was largely irrelevant to most Mexicans, and that Mexico lacked pluralism and political tolerance. I'm struck by the ways these arguments depend on a comparison which we rarely make explicit. They imply a contrast between weak democracy in Latin America and putatively stronger democracy elsewhere. Hiding the comparison facilitates some rather sloppy reasoning, because people hold up an ideal notion of late 20th century democracy in Western Europe or the US against the apparent struggles of democracy in 19th century Latin America. This is an extraordinarily bad comparison. And what I want to do today is try to drag some of that out into the open and refine it a little bit. So let me start with Mexico. Political participation expanded markedly beginning the late 18th century in Mexico for a variety of reasons that no one really planned. The Bourbons needed help in their international conflicts, and to do that, they tried to mobilize more of the population. And they weren't looking to promote political participation, but the ways in which they asked people for money and they asked people to pledge their lives in things like militias tended to come across as being relatively egalitarian compared to the way colonial ideology worked. This expansion continued, of course, once Napoleon invaded Spain and the Constitution of 1812 happened and the king was out of the picture and they wrote a liberal constitution. And in Mexico, it continued even more markedly once the violence began in 1810, where not only the insurgents but the royalists were trying to mobilize people because they needed to win. And in doing so, often inadvertently, sometimes more advertently, they brought more and more people into a sort of explicit form of politics, explicit form of political participation. And eventually this resulted in the writing of constitutions in Mexico after independence. I'm getting back to the kinds of things Cristobal was talking about. In all of these constitutions in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, citizenship and representative government were always there. They were always there. No one tried to take them away. People debated the balance between central and regional power. They debated balance between executive and legislative power. They debated even about exactly who should be allowed to vote. but no one tried to reconstitute any form that was not some kind of representative democracy. Now, how much does this matter? Okay. Well, this is a situation in which income is very unequally distributed, where social prejudice, especially racial social prejudice, is extremely important. So, well, how much does it matter that they were trying to construct this democracy in this very highly unequal nation? Well, the answer that we've come up with, and a group of people have come up with really over the last 20 years, is it mattered a surprisingly large amount. People used these sorts of Republican ideologies not only as a way to try to change politics, who's in the presidency, what the laws say, but they used them to make sense of their lives and to sort of organize their social status and social lives even in much smaller arenas, back in the mud of the villages, as Paul would say it, or in the urban neighborhoods of Mexico City, as Rich has written about quite a lot. And in doing so, they made this meaningful for them. And in some cases, they were able to influence political outcomes, broadly speaking, where they could get some laws that favored them in various ways. Okay. Now, these outcomes were always fragile. They were always contingent. They never seemed to last a long time. Okay. But the very fact that they were so in the game and so trying to be in the game really belies a lot of assumptions that we used to have about Latin American politics in the early 19th century. So I want to talk for a few minutes about sort of how these sort of social understandings of citizenship and representative government worked in different settings. First, in villages for indigenous Mexicans. What indigenous Mexicans did is they sort of adapted these new Republican liberal ideologies to the existing social realities of their lives in villages. Okay. Villages continued to control most ecological resources used by peasants. They regulated communal religious life. They organized their labor to do different kinds of village public works. Okay. And they came to associate the new notion of citizenship with an older notion of there being hijos del pueblo, sons of the village. Okay. Children of the village had certain rights and certain duties, and citizenship came to be associated with that in many parts of Mexico, not all. Okay. These rights and duties were, of course, very gendered, because respectable behavior required by villagers required men to act in a certain way and women to act in a certain way. In particular, men should support their wives and their children, and they should, above all, support and respect their elders. Ironically, this, which is a very indigenous way of thinking about the social world, actually fit really well with Hispanic patriarchy, which said pretty much the same things. Okay. So in some cases, you got villages that were their own municipalities, and they govern their politics with this new citizenship. In other places, you got larger municipalities where some non-Indian people were there, and sometimes they would dominate political office. But generally, there was some sort of accommodation with the fact that indigenous voters were there and they had to be represented. This notion of melding indigenous status as a member of a village with citizenship was always very contingent, and it always had very strong collective dimensions. Okay, so they were taking a sort of individualist, sort of Western Republican model, and they were changing it to fit their circumstances. And it didn't always work out in very peaceful ways. Very often, it was invoked in rebellions, especially rebellions where they were defending collective institutions and collective rights. Okay. We know a lot about these rebellions and how they sort of got involved in different forms of alliances beyond the village. What's increasingly clear is that even in the nominal system where they were also voting for electors who would then turn around and vote for higher officials beyond the village, for state legislatures, and then eventually all the way up to the president, they also participated in that. Elections were indirect in Mexico, as they were everywhere else, practically everywhere else at the time. And what the funny thing about this is that more Indian villagers voted in these indirect elections than you would imagine. The not so funny thing about them is they worked perfectly well from the point of view of what the theorists wanted, which was indirect elections were supposed to dilute the influence that individual people had, or that sort of common people had, on who actually held office. It worked out really well, as it worked out in most places at the time. It sort of it was a way of short-circuiting democracy. Got there. All right. Urban plebeians also had their own ideas about how all of these politics should work out for them. And for them, it was mostly a question of social status, and where they were looked down upon by urban elites, and they used this notion that everyone was equal to sort of assert their own notions of them being respectable and them having honor based on their allegiance to the nation and based upon their hard work and virtuous behavior. Okay. Now, I promised a comparison, so we're going to go there right away because I'm running out of time. Okay. If you look at the US more or less around the same time, you also see an expansion of political participation. And it's associated with the notion of Jacksonian democracy. In the 1820s and 1830s, the US went to a system where all white males, regardless of income, in pretty much every state, got voting rights. What's different about the United States, though, is that, and this is something the historiography has said a lot in the US lately, is that generally speaking, this elevation of all white males to voting status worked by eliminating rights and status of other, or reducing rights and status of other groups. African Americans lost voting rights. It was about excluding Indians, both basically deporting Indians from settled areas of the southeastern US and also fighting Indian wars on the frontiers. Women lost status, and eventually Mexicans lost status. They were also racialized and lost status. It was all about elevating one group at the expense of others. The way that the elections also worked was, it was indirect, and like Mexican elections, there were sort of raucous ceremonies where there was a lot of boasting, there was a lot of shoving, there were fist fights, the occasional rock fights, there was a lot of alcohol involved. The difference was that in Mexico they were drinking pulque, and in the US they were drinking whiskey. And pulque is definitely better for you. So what I'm aiming at is, and in fact, if you follow this comparison down, you see that political violence, as Mexico is very much known for, it was also very common in the United States. It was a different kind of political violence, but it was very much there in various ways I don't have time to talk about. Okay. So what I'm aiming for, I'm good. I'm going to get there. I was going to claim that my eyes were too bad to see that font and ask them to do a larger font. Is many of when you compare these two places at this time, you see that they're not the same, but the differences are more of degree than of kind. Okay? There's a lot of political violence in the US. There's a lot of inequality in the US. There's a lot of use of mechanisms to short-circuit democracy in the US, all like there are in Mexico. The biggest difference is on the question of pluralism, where the long colonial experience of the United States had allowed certain breaks on factionalism, in the sense of, well, okay, we are going to we might not win this time, but we'll win the next time. Okay. And eventually, even that broke down, because what ends up happening in the U.S. is that in 1860, finally the divisions have gotten to the point where the losers in the election are no longer willing to abide by the electoral results. And when it breaks down in the United States, the violence that results is so much worse than it ever is in Latin America, at least in the 19th century. More people die in the American Civil War than probably in every Latin American Civil War in the 19th century combined. And so I'll leave it at that, and because I'm definitely out of time at this point.
You have 2 more minutes.
My God, you accelerated me. I'm still going to leave it there because Rich will use his extra time. I'm following Cristobal's generous.
Thank you. I would like to begin simply by joining the chorus of folks who are thanking the organizers, and also I'm delighted that some of Friedrich's family members are here, and that Pat and John are here. It's healthy, I have learned, to say thank you. It actually, studies have shown that it improves your own life, and so I think this is a very healthy couple of days that we're enjoying together. I do, however, want to direct my first set of comments very briefly to the graduate students who are probably most have gone for the weekend. Are there still any graduate students around? Oh, hello. I rewrote, and probably will take up most of my 15 minutes in the rewrite of things that occurred to me over the course of the last 24 hours. As I see some themes that have come up, themes of how to wrestle with theory and still serve the ideographic goals of historical inquiry. The role of interdisciplinarity, the place of a broader intellectual community that was, after all, John and Friedrich and a whole other cast of characters. And I was getting kind of nostalgic about it, and then I remember that people were talking about their experiences and not mine. Which included, and Mike will remember this, Mike was probably the only person in the room when Ernesto Laclau came to campus. And Ernesto Laclau almost drove me out of graduate school because he was the first person I ever sat with in a graduate class. And he sat down and he started talking. And I didn't understand a word he was saying. His English is better than mine, certainly, but the English words he was using were not familiar to me in any way. And I did a lot of what I do when I don't know what's going on, is I pretend I know what's going on. And I was drawing smiley faces or like, little nooses around myself. And this went on, and he stopped about 30 minutes in and looked up and said, "Any questions?" And the dude sitting next to me throws his hand up, and I said, "This is great." He's going to say, "What the hell are you talking about?" But no, the dude sitting next to me was Carlos Espinosa. So not only did I not understand what was said for the last half hour, I didn't understand the question that the graduate student next to me was asking the instructor. And then I realized something about theory. It's a code, it's a practice, it's a shorthand, and I realized that I needed to learn how to use it, but not sort of be determined by it. And the other thing about sort of interdisciplinarity in theory that occurs to me, again, notice a lot of our stories are about relationships. Chuck and I had the brilliant idea of organizing directed readings with Barney Cohn to get ready for our oral exams. He was the third person on both of our oral exams. And so we had the greatest intellectual experience I think I have ever had, because we would go to Barney's office and he would like pull a book off his shelf and he'd say, "Read this." And it was, The Great Arch one week and Guns and Rain the next week and the Komarov's new book the next week. And this is great, right? So I put this together as the reading list for my orals. So my orals come around, I sit down. Barney comes in the room, sits down, and the first thing he says is, "How's your wife?" Now, I was married at the time, but I don't know how Barney knew that. And I said, "She's fine." He said, "Okay. Wait a minute. You're not Walker." And he got up and left the room. Because those of you who don't know, Chuck's wife was in the anthropology department and worked with Barney. So for those 2 minutes, he thought I was Chuck. Then he came back in the room ready to ask me questions. And the question he asked me was, "What kind of an orals reading list is this? It doesn't make any sense to me. How can you explain this as a coherent field of inquiry?" So that was sort of my reminiscence about community here. But I part of my expectation coming to this conference was that most of the participants would offer observations about how Friedrich and John influenced their scholarly trajectories. And I think to a large degree that is played out. And it's certainly true in my case. But I also want to offer another perspective, and again, a perspective that has grown like Peter's perspective on the influence that John and Friedrich have had on them. It's grown over the years, in my case, in the profession, and I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes about how, rather than try and sort of over-explicate it. A few weeks after Friedrich's memorial service in Philadelphia, which I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to attend because I live and teach in Philadelphia, I found myself in front of a class of undergraduates, and that's all I teach. I teach a lot. I teach at a liberal arts college. I don't have graduate students. So here I am in front of my class, and they're asking questions about the Mexican Revolution. And in the midst of this discussion, I actually had to ask for a moment to stop and compose myself, because I was overwhelmed by the realization that almost every word coming out of my mouth could be traced back to something that I had heard or read from Friedrich Katz. And I would imagine that may have has been other people's experience as well, but it struck me as just a very meaningful thing in this particular context to feel like I'm passing on a legacy of pedagogy, a legacy of learning to folks who are going to be accountants and lawyers, and they need this. And where did I get it? And to be able to pass that along, I think and to have you hear that, I think is very special. The other thing that I learned here, and I have a little illustration of it, I think. We talked about numbers, right? Most of us talk about numbers in our research. I'm the guy that goes into department meetings and bluffs his way through and get what I want because I learned that from John Coatsworth. It's like, well, do we need to hire someone? Yes, we need to. Look at these numbers, right? It's like, oh, very impressive, Dr. Warren. It's like, I just made this up on the way down the hall. I know, exactly, right? It's like, but they don't know. Right? That's, I got to be careful, right? And as for my presentation on my research today, there's a long and loopy path to the project that I'm working on, and it would be kind of disingenuous of me to try and draw straight lines between Friedrich and John, except to say this. When I first mentioned to John that I'd become interested in following the story of Iturbidistas through the 19th century, his response, and he may not remember this, I remember it very clearly, it was a very Coatsworthian response. He said, John, what do you think of this? He said, they lost, who cares? Now, the optimistic side of me interpreted this is John being John. It's his challenge for me to explain through why my research matters, why this issue matters. We talked a lot about that. The pessimistic side of me, which often comes close to winning this battle over time, thinks he really meant it. And maybe he's right. I think we all have moments of that in our research. But through a long series of fits and starts, I keep coming back to this project in part because it originates with something that we don't really talk so much about, but that is the relationship between the surprises in our own lives and what we wind up doing research on. And so in my case, the surprise is what I'm gonna talk about. I moved to Philadelphia to take a job because it was the job that was offered to me, and I'm forever grateful to be employed. And I work at a Jesuit Catholic university. And a couple of years after I moved to Philadelphia, an article appeared in the local section of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the newspaper of record. The headline was "The Empress in the Churchyard." Well, this empress turns out to be Augustine Iturbide's widow, who is buried outside St. John the Evangelist Church on 13th Street in Center City, Philadelphia. She had lived in Philadelphia for the last 4 decades of her life. This is an interesting sort of piece. That's not big news. More interesting to me was the way in which the story of the Iturbide family was being presented in the newspaper of record in Philadelphia. This woman was called the Martha Washington of Mexico. There were mention of rumors about possible canonization procedures beginning for her. And I began poking around some more, and I have to say here it helps to work at a Jesuit Catholic university because you have easy access to both the facilities and the staff of folks who work in things like the Archdiocesan Archive. About 5 months after this article appeared, someone passed me a photocopy of an article from the Catholic Standard and Times, which is the Archdiocesan newspaper of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Lo and behold, there's another article about Madame Iturbide, a woman, and I quote, of remarkable Christian charity, the widow of a man, quote, often compared to our country's George Washington. A man, and this, quote, a man who attempted to give a form of democratic government to Mexico, to give both the rich and poor a voice in the government, who presided over the last politically stable period in Mexico for many years. Wait, his demise was explained this way, quote, the nouveau riche revolutionaries who had helped put Iturbide in power quickly became dissatisfied with his rule because they wanted to maintain sole power over the new government. Wow, right. Now, this was written by a staff member of the archives. So now I'm guessing, absolutely. Absolutely. So now I'm guessing she must be sourcing this interpretation of Mexico's 19th century somewhere, but it wasn't coming from anything anybody in this room has written. And it was certainly a bit of a different twist on the Catholic history of Mexico than what I was used to. All those books about blood-drenched altars and Mexican martyrdom, about the Cristiada, about the Cristero War. It was a little different. So I'm following the genealogy of this idea, and I came across a citation to an article published in 1916 in a journal called The Records of the American Catholic Historical Society. It was a long article in 2 parts over 2 subsequent issues of the journal, and it was titled Don Agustín de Iturbide. Its author was also listed as Agustín de Iturbide. So I thought, like many historical journals, maybe they were translating and publishing excerpts from Iturbide's memoir, right? He wrote a memoir while he was in exile. But then I tracked down the article, and it was not. The author turns out to be the grandson of Agustín de Iturbide. Now, the only reference to Iturbide's grandchildren that I was vaguely aware of up in the time is in the literature on Maximilian and Carlotta, because this is the kid who was adopted by Maximilian and Carlotta. But then I went to the handy-dandy Diccionario Porrúa and looked him up, and this is what the Porrúa says. As an adult, quote, he did not maintain proper behavior and in the end joined a monastery where he died. That is not true. This man lived until 1925. He spent much of his adult life as a public intellectual. He wrote for the North American Review. He was featured in Harper's Weekly. He was quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He was a major public intellectual. He taught at Georgetown and Notre Dame. He was a major public intellectual who influenced how a lot of folks in the United States, Catholics, thought about and apparently still think about Mexican history. And he also, in his own personal archive, we see correspondence that he has back and forth to Mexico through the revolution. Like he's corresponding about what are we going to do now that we're going to get the country back from the liberals, meaning the Porfiristas. So anyway, that's my time. Yeah, we're going to sit in silence for 2 minutes. But that's sort of that interplay between our own personal trajectory. I would have never thought about, there's no interesting question there without the lived experience of sort of digging and poking and saying, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. The accepted wisdom of really conservative Catholics in Philadelphia doesn't reconcile with the questions I think I want to answer. And so that's led me down to this rabbit hole of trying to write the story of the grandson, Agustín Iturbide y Green. And so I'll end with that.
Well, thanks to what I've discovered is the great intimidating power of keeping time on the iPad, we have about 40 minutes for discussions, so lots of time for everyone to jump in.
I have just one observation. I found this to be a very brilliant panel, and it presents a kind of a paradox to me, in that people who are doing such innovative forms, all of you, of political history, trained with people who would be hard to classify, either John or Friedrich at that time, as doing anything resembling political history. So I'm wondering if there's a way in which you all can explain more your paths to, what are truly original ways of doing political history. One thing I was mostly mesmerized by, I have some very specific questions for Laura, because I'm mesmerized by this story. It's a great topic, and I particularly like the way in which you take topics such as, Holocaust stories or Bolivia during the 40s, things that are usually put in such parochial terms, and you're linking them to these global connections and global social movements. And I think that's, I think you're right to say that has a lot to do with the inspiration of Friedrich, but it's a wonderful way of getting at this. but I had three small questions I wanted to ask you about this. One is, I was, in my own work on cocaine, I did pick up something about groups after the war of Jewish and German refugees who I thought were vital in the creation of what I call cocaine capitalism in the 1950s. Almost all the people who came up in the press or in secret reports, intelligence reports, seemed to belong to those two categories, and I was kind of fascinated with the idea that their paths might crisscross after the war in kind of business arrangements. But what the question I wanted to, and I still don't know if that was true. At the time, the source I used most was that book, Hotel Bolivia. But what came out of your story that I wanted to ask the question about is, if this is true about the pioneering role that Jewish refugees and Germans, many of whom I thought were Nazi emigres, for various reasons I thought that, learned something about crossing borders and illicitness through this experience of the ways in which they entered into Bolivia and lived in Bolivia during the 1940s, where there's some continuity between that and the creation of kind of these illicit networks in the 1940s. Second, I was just wondering something about, you fit this so well into kind of the question of transnational and political movements of the time, but it seemed to me that I was wondering if you had done any work in oral history, but also in kind of the memory politics of this. And this is just a tidbit, but I don't know whether you know this transnational connection, but didn't I anglicized it, the Rothschilds, didn't they move to California after the revolution, expropriations, and wasn't Adam Rothschild, who was the grandchild of the man who you focus on, wasn't he the founder of Mother Jones magazine? And so the reverberations of this continue. I think he's still involved with the magazine, continue even into U.S. politics today. I mean, using this to, line of progressive politics that hasn't been stopped. And I was also wondering if you could compare this case, which seems to have happened sort of very spontaneously. There were these connections, but there was this moment of illicitness, with the more kind of organized rescue and colonization things. And what comes to mind, I'm sure you've read this book by Alan Wells, who, by the way, was a Stony Brook PhD, called Tropical Zion, about the Trujillo regime's sort of very planned approach to bringing Jewish refugees, mostly from Vienna, to the Dominican Republic. And it's a fascinating piece of transnational history and the way that he approaches it. But I'm wondering in what ways this process had a very different kind of constitution and outcome than what you saw there in Bolivia.
Fabulous questions. What do you want us to do?
Well, there were questions for everybody.
Yeah, why not?
I have a short answer to your first question. I'm not going to answer the questions you had for Laura. I am a failed economic historian. John was actually thankful to let me go off and do other things, because I tried to write an MA paper on the silver market in post-independence Mexico, and it was a stinking pile of hooey, and when I said I wanted to go do something else, he's like, right on.
that class on economic history, I've always thought that we should make a spaghetti western out of that. It was so you lost patience with me. Steve Bain could prove something, but then he got their countries wrong. There's a great.
That's right.
We quickly, any credentials in economic history were thrown away.
I just want to answer a little bit Paul's question of how we got there, and it doesn't hold for everyone, but when I started graduate school, Friedrich and John had been working extensively in the Riot, Rebellion, Revolutions book, and my first year, Rich was in this seminar, Chuck was in the seminar, Robin was in this seminar. There was a seminar on rebellions in Latin America, 18th century to 20th century. And it was a very great experience. I didn't walk in there knowing anything about it. And I came to politics through considering rebellions more through kind of social movement theory, read things like, you know, Charles Tilley and James Scott, the early James Scott, and stuff like that. And that's how I got into politics. And so it's all John's fault for teaching the seminar.
Yeah, I would echo what Rich, to the larger question about the political influence, I mean, about getting to political history, what Rich and Peter have said. I was at the, I guess, the tail end of Riot, Rebellion, Revolution, but it was very much in the air when I was here. And I think that, and that certainly influenced, what I was doing on Bolivia. But I think also, as I think about what I'm doing now, I mean, a lot of it too was just in a general sense of sort of thinking about social movements. So doing what we might call political history was never sort of what one might think in a traditional or standard sort of way about what is political history. It was always part of a sort of social movement perspective. It was about political engagement. It was about eclecticism, as people have discussed in various different ways. And I mean, I feel like in what I'm researching now that I'm looking at a social movement, and the leaders of it may have been unwitting leaders, but it seems to have been, and there's a border also. Oh, do you want, yeah, well, so you still want to comment on the other, and then I can say a little bit, or whatever you think.
Yes, yo siempre tuve dos fascinaciones para hacer mi tesis. Una, siempre me ha gustado el mundo de la anarquía, digamos, el caos. A mí me fascinó el inicio del siglo XVI, digamos, la conquista hasta Toledo. Nunca lo hice porque the handwriting is a nightmare, you know. And then my second choice is la República Temprana. Y me influenció mucho también François Furet en los estudios, y había una vinculación muy fuerte entre Furet y Katz, ¿no? Y de ahí viene mi cuestión de la historia política. Pero digamos, lo que has escuchado es un exceso de estudios, de discurso político, pero es una cuestión del azar que alguien me convocó para hacer un gran proyecto de investigación sobre este tema, ¿no? Porque lo anterior fue una cosa más, digamos, una combinación, menos discurso, que he hecho un libro sobre la historia de las elecciones en el Perú, que fue mi segundo proyecto.
So I'll just quickly, I mean, Paul, first, just thank you so much. These are such great questions and give me so much to think about. And I guess I would just say, just briefly, each one, the thing about the Nazi emigres as part of this whole picture is crucial. And one of the things that's really interesting is, the ways in which, I mean, in some ways these were separate communities, but they overlapped. And people talk a lot about their encounters with people who were presumed to be Nazis, before the war. I mean, before the war, during the war, and then after the war, that focuses specifically on Klaus Barbie, who passed, not as Klaus Barbie, but as Klaus Altmann, and no one at first knew who he was, but everyone was having business deals with him. People have a lot of stories about that encounter. So I think one of the things that's really important, this notion of sort of living illicitly and what people learn from each other, it's a great way to think about it. But I think it has to be sort of connected with this idea of multiple exile communities, but that overlapped. And the second about the transnational political movements and Hochschild, I think he's the nephew of this mine owner. And he has a memoir that's very interesting. There's some sort of allusions to the whole kind of family politics. He had a very complicated relationship to his family, as you could imagine. But Hochschild himself, the one in Bolivia, he was maybe had the distinction of two different governments called for his execution. One in the 1930s and then again 1944. And he actually left after that second call. He never went back to Bolivia after 1944. What?
They live in Peru, the Hochschild family.
Oh, they do? They went to Peru.
They are extremely wealthy, they have $2.5 billion. It's one of the wealthiest families in Peru. Extremely powerful.
But what I am doing, I mean, every time I mention that I'm doing this, someone says, I know someone who was in Bolivia. I mean, that's what makes me think that the larger numbers are, worth thinking about seriously. But one of the things that people, when I say, because everybody talks about it is, people have stories, yes, corruption and, all these things, and okay, that was part of it. But then I say, well, I think, that there was a great movement of solidarity and everyone is shocked. But then people have stories, and then they start, and then it turns out that, well, in this case it was like this, and in another like this. So the oral history sort of for thinking about both the Bolivian social movement, because a lot of Bolivians were doing extraordinary things in support of these refugees also, which is not part of Bolivia's historical memory of its own sort of history. But then a lot of other sorts of complicated memories come out. And the third thing about, just about sort of the story that Wells tells for the Dominican Republic. I mean, what you have in Bolivia is, it starts as that. Bolivia has a long history of wanting to develop these colonization progresses. They go back to independence, and you have throughout the 19th century, and then you have laws that support them in the early 20th century, and they don't amount to very much, but there's a great deal of enthusiasm for this. And so when this kind of, from the Bolivian sort of looking to progress moment of opportunity comes, that's the way that it's looked at. We're going to colonize these areas, and then the Chaco War, and Paraguay wants to do it. There's a lot of different things there. So that's where Hochschild comes in. But then there's a whole other agenda and groups of people, and what makes Bolivia different from the Dominican Republic is this community in formation of refugee Jews on the one hand, but very, very important, its connections to Argentina, which is the largest Jewish population in Latin America. And the connections are so organic, it's astounding. And that played a crucial role.
Dave, you had a question?
That's a question similar to what Paul asked about economic history, and that is, I mean, one common denominator of these presentations is they're each about translation in some way, although the theme of the panel is comparison. But I do have a feeling that there's been a decline in comparativist Latin Americanism in our field, in historiography, and that the kinds of comparative heuristics I took for granted as a graduate student, that question asking where you were always impelled to say, well, how is this different from Argentina? That declined along with dependency theory. For better or for worse, dependency theory mandated a certain level of structural comparison that isn't mandated anymore. And so I guess I would ask a question, is it simply that John Coatsworth and Friedrich Katz were requiring that you do comparative history or comparative thinking, or is it that the times in which you were entering the study of history were ones in which comparative questions, why are the revolutions in Central America different from one another? Comparative history was mandated both by political problematics and also by dependency theory, which gave comparative or which gave structural explanations for a variety of cases.
I can answer in another way. Your question is, at least in Peru, in the Andes, the Spanish embassy, the French embassy, all the time organize conference in which they have to be a Peruvian and Boliviano, and Ecuadoriano, Colombiano, and Venezolano, because that's the Cooperación Internacional. And also the Spanish all the time are organizing, they have money to invite a lot of people, and put together. At least since I'm in Peru, there is a lot of seminars among Latin Americans. In the Andes, no? It's no theory, but
it's money.
Money, yes.
Well, and follow the money. I mean, structurally, we are Latin Americanists. And so in order to prepare for a career, right, we're not reading only the historiography of Mexico. We're expected, I mean, I don't know how many, like I said, my job, I teach a course on Mexican history once every 3 years. And I got very good advice in graduate school, which was the odds that you will teach at a place like the place you are being trained approach 0. So you better be ready to do. Right. So you better be. I don't mean that was not personal. It was the cohort. It was like,
That was after that.
Really?
No one ever told that to you? Oh, maybe it was me. Maybe it was just me. Thanks, John.
Yes.
I wanted to ask Peter to please unpack a bit the comparisons that you said are there to be made to challenge the generalization of sort of the stability in the U.S. in the 20s, when you talked about the empowerment of some groups and disempowerment between what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in the U.S. Can you flesh that a bit?
Wow, that's you're asking me to actually give the paper I wrote rather than one I hurriedly rushed through. Okay, I'm not going to quite do it that way, although I promise to send it to you. But what I'll say is really interesting about trying to do this comparative project now is that I find myself often having trouble conversing with U.S. historians. Not because they're not intelligent, they're very intelligent. Not because they don't work very hard, they work very hard. They just see things differently. There's a sort of cultural conflict between the way I see things and the way they see things. And like for this question of what is political instability? I look at the U.S. in the early 19th century, and what looms in my mind is a civil war as an incident of political instability. They almost never talk about it as political instability. It's formative in their vision of U.S. history in so many ways, but not as political instability, not as a sort of as a political breakdown. Okay, and it's very dramatic to me, and the reason that I see it that way is that so much of the way people were looking at Mexico in that time was about political instability. So I understand why they look at it the way that they do and why I look at it the way that I do. So sometimes I say things like this and they look at me like, no, the U.S., no, I mean, it was institutionally very stable. I say, no, it wasn't, right? And so we have these sort of conversations. I can't give sort of the whole paper, but I will say just on the issue of gender. I'll just talk about gender for a second, okay? And here, to do this kind of comparison, you have to do synthesis. You have to read all kinds of other people because you can't do it all yourself, right? Historians of gender in the early 19th century have pointed out that a lot of this Jacksonian democracy was associated with the sort of construction and dominance of a particular kind of masculinity, which Amy Greenberg calls martial masculinity. It was a conflict over what being a man meant, and in martial masculinity, being a man was about dominating others. It was about dominating women. It was about dominating Mexicans. It was about dominating Indians. It was about dominating blacks. Okay, and this fit really well in the Jackson. We think of it's domination. It can't be democratic, right? But it actually fits really well with the extension of rights to all white males, because in this burgeoning economy where we have lots of winners and losers, there are lots of white males who are losers economically, but they get a great deal of psychological and cultural satisfaction if they can still be physically dominant and martially dominant, even if they still have a hard time making a living. So it works really well in terms of bringing people into the political system and making them feel like they're part of something, even if they're losing their jobs or having a harder and harder time being independent, craftspeople in New York or something like that. So all this stuff really fits together. We were talking about economics and social structures, and when you start putting things together, they start to make more sense. I think that's the biggest lesson in my career. The more I add to every equation, the more it makes sense. And I think that's straight from John and Friedrich. It took me a while to figure it out, though.
Chris Ford.
I really enjoyed this panel, and it seems to me that one of the points of agreement amongst them is a little bit about the question of memory. And in the following sense, not long ago with a group of graduate students, we read Benedict Anderson on the nation. And I found myself being quite unsatisfied with it as an explanation of nationhood for the first time, because I remembered sort of thinking this was quite good. And I think that the problem was that it missed that little element of the invented tradition. That is to say, that one of the things that makes a people is in part the reality, or at least the possible, deniable plausibility of having a common background, of having common experiences. So one of the things that Laura's, starting out with this, inventing a memory right away through jokes about our experiences of going through this. So my question is, I guess, to what extent, first of all, to what extent do you all think, I'm thinking about Richard's work here in particular, because in the 1920s, people were still celebrating Iturbide in Michoacan for obvious reasons, and they thought that was very important to celebrate this as the real Michoacan bringer of liberate. If that's true, it does mean that we have a little bit of a link as professional historians in being the organizers, or at least the official, self-appointed repositories of certain memories. And so to what extent then do you think there's a link between the way that people form memories in order to create themselves as groups and understand what their political positions are, whether that is the memory of the United States as a stable place, despite the fact, we would forget the Whiskey Rebellion, whatever, or the memory that is more political. And if in fact it is true that we're doing that, is what we're doing here today also trying to create an invented tradition of Katzworthian, the Jack Katzworth generation? Is this wise for us to do?
Back in the back, sorry, in the picture.
Yes. Well, I kind of connects with what Chris just said. So, this is America, and this is after the 1980s with an increasing hyper-individualism, and where the self and the individual is just unbearable. And but Friedrich Katz comes out of Austria-Hungary, and Friedrich Katz was splendid, phenomenal, and I think what actually really sets him apart is that he was brilliant as a practitioner and brilliant as a soul, as a man. That is actually rare. So many awful people out there. God makes so few who had that combination. But Friedrich Katz comes. We just say some other names. Manus Sperber. Those are all people you don't know, or some perhaps you do. Elias Canetti. That is an entire culture that has disappeared. And also what these people did is they wrote essays. They didn't do science. It comes out of the Austrian-Hungarian tradition of the enlightened essay writer. Those were the explainers. That was the journals he bought that were for highfalutin people. It was beautiful, erudite writing without being hemmed in by social science. And so that tradition is not very existing in the United States. And John fits in some way in an American tradition in there. What has never been said though is he always struck me. He would tell the story how he got hired. So it was whenever we would say, I just got here by luck, and then he's so we don't. He represents openness, the '60s, inventiveness, and serendipity, and that is, and then the man in the moment. They make something brilliant out of that. But so that is as not a shadow, but a beautiful yellow poster behind the radiant light of the individuals that we think of today.
Niels Jacobson.
Yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things about Peter's presentation, which I enjoyed a lot, as I enjoyed all of these. And I was also struck by the coincidence between Cristobal and Peter in terms of the importance of this unified view of seeing politics. But I think, Peter, you're absolutely right that we need to sort of look more at the similarities between what's the political processes in 19th century Latin America and the United States. And the issue of how many people get killed through political violence of different forms it is a fascinating one. I think you're underestimating the Latin American record of that. The War of 1,000 Days in Colombia killed 100,000 people. And there were several other civil wars in Colombia where 30,000 people were killed. So there are some civil wars in Latin America that were extremely deadly. Then one needs to ask, why are some civil wars much more deathly than others, much more lethal than others? And I think it has something to do with the level of organization of political factions, and perhaps sort of as we move on into the 20th century, obviously also of the power of the state to affect people's lives, so to affect them bodily. I mean, that's obviously the difference why, say, Argentine fascism was never able to kill as many people as German fascism, right? That clearly the Argentine state was not the German state. But I just want to point out that I think we may underestimate the death toll of 19th century Latin American civil wars.
Paraguay.
Paraguay, exactly, yeah.
Sometimes with numbers I'm very scared. I remember always the example of Tupac Amaru in Puno, that many historians mention the numbers, and the numbers are higher than the people, the statistics, you know. Say that
People died several times.
Yeah, yes.
Cowards.
Die early, die often.
Vote often. So, let me just say one quick thing about numbers. Numbers are really hard, and one of the reasons they're really hard is that people throw them around so casually. Okay, and I'm not saying that you're throwing them around casually. Okay, but one of the things that's sort of recently come out about the Civil War, by basically doing demographic analysis of sort of who's missing at the end of the war, okay, rather than trying to count casualties on battlefields, comes up with 1 million people, okay, within a very small margin. Okay. I think also you have to think about the ferocity, in the sense of, well, Latin America has this reputation for ferocious political violence, and clearly that's definitely true in many situations in Latin America, although probably more in the 20th century than the 19th century. But then the ferocity of the American Civil War was really quite incredible. I mean, the things, how do you treat your enemies when they're under your control? What happens to prisoners of war in the American Civil War? It's incredible. Right here in Chicago and in Andersonville, in a situation where this is a prosperous country where feeding your prisoners of war shouldn't be such a difficult thing to do. I mean, what happens to an American soldier captured in the Civil War by the opposite side is so different from what happens to an American soldier captured in the Mexican-American War by the Mexicans. It's not even funny. The Mexicans continue to feed American soldiers as well as they can, literally until the Americans get to the gates of Mexico City. That's when they basically run out of money at that point. They can't feed them anymore. Okay, they're not feeding their own people, their own soldiers, but they're feeding the American prisoners. I mean, there's lots of ways we could go with this comparison. Okay, but I still think there's this way in which we think about U.S. history, where if we apply the same kind of thinking that we routinely apply to Latin America, we come up with some really interesting things.
Yeah, but there is a war that was very dirty in Latin America, the Paraguayan War.
That was the one where there was, which was not a civil war, though. It was a war between national states.
Yeah, yes.
Right.
Many hands. Yes.
I just want to, a couple of comments. To you, Peter, I agree with you as someone who followed the migrants she was studying, across the border and had to negotiate with the U.S. historiography. But I think it's bigger than that, because the U.S. historiography doesn't, or until of late, it doesn't focus on the state. And so by not focusing on the state as a political actor, which is, I was shocked about coming from Latin America. I mean, you ask and there is nothing, right? Now there is, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that has now broken with this and sees the state as an actor. But this is essentially the problem, that people were much more interested in the nation as opposed to the state. So to you, Laura, interesting comment that I really liked your, I liked everybody's, what they said, but interestingly enough, so my work on 68 has found that so many of the women who were involved in 68 in Mexico were Spanish and Jewish, the daughters of Spanish and Jewish exiles. And that, I mean, at first we thought it was an oddity of the people we were, but it ends up, I don't think being. I think this is part of the legacy of what you were talking about.
That's really interesting.
Just quickly, Laura, I was going to make some other broader comments, but I think I won't. But I think a lot of us will leave this, if you say, what did you learn at the conference, or the sort of fact, this astonishing, I mean, it really is a great introduction because no one thinks of massive Jewish refugees in Bolivia. But one reason perhaps, and what I want, and it might be simply because they all ended up in Argentina, those of us who know a little bit about Bolivian sort of political and intellectual circuits, certainly is not the Jewish presence today of Argentina. There is no, I was trying to think of Jewish intellectuals in Argentina, dozens. In Mexico, I mean, it's also Spain, but I mean, Colegio de Mexico also has influence. What happened to these people as a community? And it's in the second book, but just briefly, if you know.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question. I mean, a lot of things happened to them because the idea, I mean, and the idea that people have in their head is that everyone wanted to leave. They didn't really want to be there, and so they left as quickly as they could. And many did, but many stayed. 1946 was another, after the overthrow of, after the end of the war and the overthrow of Villarroel, that's another moment of exodus. Then after the 1952 revolution, but then still lots of people stayed, and into the 70s, really, there were significant Jewish communities in both La Paz and Cochabamba, and then eventually in Santa Cruz also. And it's really only today that people say, we are dying out, or we are no longer here, and all the young people are leaving. And I think that, but I think that the thing that's important about it, and that is not part of the sort of, I mean, when I mention this, and when I'm in Bolivia and I mention this to Bolivians that I'm writing about this, everyone also has a story, On that corner there was the shop, the perfume shop that was run by this Jewish man, or this, here we had these parties. And so it is, the presence was strong and is remembered, but it's not part of the historical memory of sort of Bolivian national history. And it was a crucial piece of that sort of moment of rescue, but also of the unfolding sort of political and economic and cultural history of Bolivia. So, but there's a lot of stories. I mean, people wound up in Israel, in New York, in Bolivia, and in Argentina, and those diasporas, I think, are really important, and they happen different, like generationally, different moments, and for different reasons and in different ways.
Just a direct comment on that. Several years ago, when immigration restrictions in Europe were becoming very, very strong, and Latin Americans were suffering under that, Evo Morales gave a famous speech where he sort of said, how ungrateful are the Europeans. We've always given them refuge, and they always were allowed to come. And I'm wondering whether there was any possibility that he remembered that he had heard about some of what Bolivia had done during the war.
That's so interesting to know. I hadn't heard that speech.
Oh, that's a very
I don't know that
speech.
speech. Yeah, I have to look for that speech. I mean, there's, well, I mean, it's not that people don't know, but I think that they're almost, I mean, I don't know, I have to think about it more, but it comes in little bits and pieces. There are, especially in the 90s, actually, because there are all these institutions. The idea a lot of people have is that people came and then they left. And that's not true. They established all of these institutions, and institutions to which Bolivians also, participated in. Some of the best schools were established by Jews, and Bolivians attended those schools also. So there's a lot of remembrance of that. And I think that those sort of kind of institutional imprint that was made are very much a part of things. And some of the leaders who created those institutions reached, it was in the 1990s, when they started, because to go to Chris's question too, I mean, when you talk about Holocaust memory, there are generations of silence and memory and forgetting and remembering, and so that's all part of this. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it was in the 90s. It's of course after some of these people are victims of the dictators also in the 70s and 60s. So it's in the 90s, it's the return to democracy, it's a new sort of moment in which people are remembering lots of different kinds of things. And there appear in the newspapers a number of oral histories by some of the leaders elderly leaders of the Jewish community who were beginning, to pass away in the late 90s and the 2000s. And so certainly Bolivians are reading those. Those are in the national newspapers. People know. But I think it gets pigeonholed into this thing whenever people talk about it. Well, that's because, they were all corrupt. They believed this trial, that everyone was corrupt and it was all self-interested. But what they don't do is to connect it with this incredible social movement that had connections across Latin America. It's the sort of the way people think about it, I think.
I think we have time for maybe one more question before we all break for lunch.
Great panel. I was just, I have a student who, well, I ended up with a student who, we've been talking a little bit about social science approaches, and Jose Moya is an outstanding historian of migration who magnificently works with both the right and the left hand. I mean, he counts really, really well, and he reads letters and poetry really, really well. It seems like all the great social science goes to Columbia, because he's now at Barnard. We lost him, but I inherited a fabulous student who, and I was interested in the connection you were mentioning between Bolivia and Argentina, because Mir Yarfitz just did like the definitive study of prostitution in Argentina, which is organized through the Zui Migdal, and his work it builds upon Donagai's stuff because he did the Yiddish newspapers, and he worked in the UN archives, and it's a truly transnational study of the sex trade and the role of in Jewish prostitution. And I just wondered the connection to Argentina. I just wondered going backwards, because Zui Migdal was the organizing. I want to call it a mutual aid society that got involved in organizing the brothels and so forth. And I just wondered, it was organized into, it was an institution into the 1930s, and then I think it was disbanded. And I just wondered if there was a link vis-a-vis the Zui Migdal.
That I don't know, but it's really worth thinking about. I don't know. I haven't come across that yet, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, in Bolivia there aren't very many Jews until really 1935. 1935, there's a small community of Polish Jews who arrive, and they create the first institution, and they get the ear of this Minister of Foreign Affairs first, and then the sort of Germans come in, and there's a division and all of that. But so before 1935, I guess it would be hard to imagine strong connections, because they're not really there. But after that, I mean, there are all kinds of, they're going in both directions. I mean, there's Jews who are in Bolivia who are going to Argentina, but there are also Jews who are in Argentina who are going to live in Bolivia. And somebody apparently carried 1,500 Bolivian passports to Argentina. And so what were those used for? How does that all fit together? But, and there are people in Argentina who are intervening in the Bolivian debates. But your question about these other kinds of institutions, I mean, there are a lot of Argentinian papers that are being read in Bolivia too, and the Argentinian Jewish papers are reporting on Bolivia. So I wouldn't be surprised to find these other kinds of organizations also having connections, but I haven't seen them yet, but it's a great question.
Chris Jones?
Yes, I wanted to go back to the question that Dane raised about whether or not this comparative approach that we inherited from Friedrich was kind of a function of the time and the dependency movement, because I think we all know that Friedrich was doing the comparative approach much before then, but I'm listening to this panel today, and I'm seeing that the tradition is being carried on and engaging with very contemporary issues, historiographical issues. So I didn't hear anyone address that directly, but so I wanted to jump in and say something about it. I don't know if that's my observation. Thanks.
Well, this has been a wonderful demonstration, I think, both of the tradition that came out of those years of finding in unexpected and counterintuitive evidence the roots of really original history. And also, I think, actually a testament to how alive the tradition of not just the new idea of the transnational, but also comparative history, which is really a very different thing, how alive that tradition really is today. So thanks to all of our panelists and all